Are the Russians meddling in U.S. and world energy markets? Well, despite credible, bipartisan concerns, we really don't know for sure, and we need to. That is the conclusion of a piece written at thehill.com by John Locke Foundation Senior Fellow Don Vaart. Don used to be the Secretary of North Carolina's Department of Environmental Quality before he joined the John Locke Foundation. In this piece written for The Hill, he details the instances that lead to serious questions about Russian collusion. He also has some recommendations for the Trump administration as well. Don, welcome to Carolina Journal Radio.
Thanks for having me.
So how and why are the Russians meddling in energy markets?
Well, the first thing we have to recognize is that natural gas is an extremely important commodity for Russia. More than 50% of their export revenues come from natural gas. So anytime the natural gas supplies change, Russia's interested. And of course, North America has experienced a revolution in natural gas production over the last 10 years.
Fracking.
Due to hydraulic fracturing. And that has significantly increased the supply of natural gas. And some of this is being considered for export to the same markets that Russia is selling their natural gas into, namely Europe, Eastern Europe.
It sounds as if you're describing competitive pressures, and the Russians are taking notice.
That's exactly right. And what is remarkable is not that Russia is concerned about competitors. Anybody in business has those feelings. What is remarkable is that Russia is using, apparently, according to Hillary Clinton and others, environmental groups to try to dissuade North America's hydraulic fracturing efforts.
How so?
Well, there are a number of different instances where protesters have been apparently funded by Russian groups to show up at meetings that where the expansion of hydraulic fracturing is being discussed. One instance when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, she was speaking at an energy event where she also referred to phony, those are her terms, phony environmental groups that are protesting for pay, whether it's, as she said, fracking or pipelines. At the time, the XL pipeline was still being held up. This is a concern at two levels. First of all, we have Russians, apparently, who are funding protests that affect our energy policy. Americans' energy policy is something that can be debated, but when we have undue influence being funded by not our favorite nations, we should be concerned and recognize that. The other issue, which is the one that I'm most concerned about, well, I'm also concerned about, is the fact that the use of these environmental groups will cheapen and corrupt, in the eyes of Americans, the value of these groups.
And in fact, that very notion there is one of the reasons that you make a recommendation to the Trump administration to look into this. And it's curious because I'm sure our listeners know, unless you've been living in a cave for the last year and a half, there's been all sorts of media coverage, speculation, some facts and data coming out about whether or not Russia was involved some way, and it looks like the intelligence is saying they were doing things on the web, etc., involving the 2016 presidential election. Yet your point in this column that you wrote for The Hill is that why isn't anyone similarly concerned about potential meddling, collusion, whatever you want to call it, in our energy markets?
That's exactly right. Nobody likes the idea of folks meddling, foreign entities not friendly to us, meddling in our elections, but they should be very concerned about the meddling in our energy policy. And again, from an environmental standpoint, when I see the possibility that one or more of the special interest environmental groups that we have all looked to and trusted may be being corrupted by serving as a proxy for the Russians in this meddling, then I want to clear the air. I want to make sure that that we know who they are and we know who they aren't, so that going forward we can continue to rely on those that have resisted or have not taken part in this sort of corrupt sort of activity.
You mentioned the former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and her comments about this, but you also detail in your piece that a key official at NATO has made comments about this, expressing concerns. Also, there's a House committee report that gets to this issue. Do environmental groups understand, or have they discussed that there might be some compromising things going on here with their message?
This is my question. Where are the environmental groups on the question of taking money from Russians? One of the reports that is cited in the paper details money going through a offshore account back into some environmental groups here in America. Now, that may be innocent enough, but at the same time, since it's Russian money, and since we have Hillary Clinton claiming that Russians were funding some environmental groups, I'd like to know who is who. And by doing that, we find out what influence Russia really is having in our energy policy discussions.
One would think that the environmental groups who have spent decades really building their credibility, their reputation, would be concerned and that they would want the air to be cleared, as you put it.
Well, that's a great point. If I were working for EDF or NRDC, and I'm just naming a few, this would be very troublesome to me because, as I point out, there have been reports on this. This was reported in the New York Times and Newsweek, elsewhere. If I were a member of the public who was aware of this possibility, I'm just left to speculating who is being corrupted and who isn't. And so if I were, as I said, one of these environmental groups, I'd want to clear the air as well.
What should happen now?
Well, frankly, if there's not the kind of reporting that you refer to in the as is going on in the elections meddling situation, I would want the Trump administration, maybe an interagency effort, to look into it, and it would also be in response to the concern shown by some of the representatives that wrote letters that I referred to.
Now, you mentioned that there is a House report that referred to some of this. Does that mean that there are members of Congress who might be willing to perhaps push for some sort of investigatory body or effort?
I would think so. Lamar Smith from Texas is one who wrote a letter and who participated in the study. I would think he'd be very interested to know what's going on.
Ultimately, Don, what's at stake here when we talk about the U.S. and the world energy market?
Two things. One is perhaps a corrupted influence on our energy policy as it proceeds, and the other is a loss of credibility of some of the very groups that have helped us establish new environmental policies going forward.